This is episode 630 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Nella Domenici. She is running for the U.S. Senate against Martin Heinrich, the incumbent Democrat candidate. And welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Nella.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, not a day goes by that something mind blowing and shattering doesn't happen in national politics. And I'm sure that's trickled down to you, but maybe not mind blowing. But the most recent big news is that Kamala Harris, who is now of course, Democrats' candidate for the presidency, moving up from vice president, has chosen Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, to be her VP candidate. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, we all just heard in the last sort of hour and a half, so these are very fresh thoughts. But he's an extreme radical progressive, just like Kamala, and just like all seven leaders here in New Mexico, and including Martin Heinrich. And we've seen here in New Mexico that these extreme radical policies have really done nothing but destroy our great state. We're the number one state for crime, and we're the worst state for education, and we're failing in many, many other areas. And many of these problems are caused by the radical progressives. So he's as close to a socialist as you can get. And it's very sort of disappointing and interesting that she picked someone so far to the left, but it will make our race much, much easier because she's put a stake in the ground as to where she is, and she's exactly in the zip code that's really ruined our state and caused lots of problems here. Martin Heinrich is attached to her. He'll be attached to him, and those are the kind of leaders that have proven their strategies don't work in New Mexico.
Yeah, I'll add a few points. One, of course, Minneapolis was ground zero during the George Floyd protests and riots. Tim Walz did nothing to stop them at that time. He shares, kind of the mainstream now Democratic Party's radical environmental agenda. A lot of people thought that Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, would wind up being her choice, partially because he's a moderate ish, at least by Democrat standards these days. But I think the radical Democratic base was not looking forward to somebody who was kind of sympathetic to Israel. So a lot of interesting points there, and feel free to jump in and comment on any of them.
I mean, I really think there's two key areas for New Mexico where we know he's going to be, his policies will be devastating to our state. So he's anti-oil and gas, and we need leaders who understand that, yes, clean energy is important, diversified portfolios of energy, capabilities are very important for our state and for the country, but we can't kill the oil and gas industry, an industry that's so important to our state and so important to our country's being energy independent, and that makes it important to our defense and our global position as the leader of the free world. But he's also very, very radical as it relates to the open border, as is Kamala. And New Mexicans are fed up with the open border. They want a border that's fairly secure, in a very legal way, consistently with the policies and principles. They do not want this just random, huge flow of all sorts of people into our state and into our country. But that is his position. That's Kamala's position. And so United they'll stand, and we'll just fight against them on that.
All right. Well, at this time of the campaign, you're traveling around a lot, meeting with different groups of people. You were recently up in Navajo country, speaking of people who have been impacted by energy issues in our state. How were you received in Navajo country, and what other places have you been traveling to? And just talk about that experience.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been really, in the last several weeks, traveled thousands of miles. I've been really all around the state, but more in the very recent, say, 2 weeks, I've been down in the Las Cruces area, Silver City, Hatch. Then I've zipped up to the northern part of the state, Farmington, Gallup, Grants, Cuba. So I've been all over. And of course, as you mentioned, I was in Shiprock. I really, when I travel, I spend a lot of time really getting to know the companies in the areas, the schools, the healthcare issues. I try to have as just lots of direct interactions with all types of people. I want to give you three examples of areas where radical regulations and excessive regulations have really hurt our economy, and they've caused our state to actually lose jobs, and they've caused lots of damage to our communities. So first, let me just tell you, for example, down in Hatch, I met with farmers who are, growing chili and onions and whatnot. Because the regulations there are so high, it's very, very hard for the small growers to even survive. And many of the larger, wealthier ones, because of the regulations, are just leaving and creating their farms in Mexico, where the regulations are much less harsh. And then the ones who leave make it more difficult for the ones who stay in New Mexico, where it's much, much more expensive to do business because of the regulations. So that's an area, for example, where jobs have really been lost. They've been lost to Mexico, ironically. But another example of similar things is in Shiprock, and I spent a half day there really trying to understand their issues, and it's quite sad to learn about the jobs in the Shiprock area and to learn what New Mexico leadership has done to the Navajo Nation. So those plants were closed in the last couple of years. Promises were made that there would be a very constructive, healthy glide path where people would be retrained and they would get new jobs. So let me remind you, those were great jobs they had. They paid $70,000, $80,000 a year with good health benefits. But even when those plants were open, they had a high unemployment. But once the plants were closed, their unemployment has just soared. They didn't have the exact number, but they were throwing around numbers like 70% unemployment. Yes, 70, 70. That's huge. But let me just explain the consequences of that because they're terrible. What happened when those plants closed is the people had nowhere to work. And literally, many parents started, going to places like Albuquerque so they could either get trained or get jobs or both. But they had to leave their children behind. Now, homeless children in the Navajo Nation is actually a serious, serious problem. And many of the children who aren't homeless are living with their grandparents. So this situation where jobs have been destroyed and the promises to recreate the jobs and the promises to train the people so they get those jobs were completely failed has caused not only people to be unemployed, but they're really hurting the youth. They're hurting the children. They're making it really hard for them to be well fed, to be happy, healthy, and educated. So the consequences are just terrible. We also have other areas in our state where potential jobs are not being created. So, for example, in the oil and gas industry, I've talked to many CEOs, and New Mexico has the best part of the Permian Basin below it. We have the Delaware Basin. That's where all the oil and gas companies want to be. But you know what? That many of them choose not to be here, or they choose to restrict their investments in our state. Therefore, they're restricting job growth in our state, and they're going to the Texas side because, again, the regulations are so much easier to deal with, and getting leases is so much easier on the Texas side. But we also have, and I want to be thoughtful about all parts of the economy. We have our ranchers, our cattle ranchers, who also are losing jobs and losing economic benefit and economic prosperity because of these radical regulations. So, for example, I was up north of Espanola, about between Espanola and Chama, meeting with ranchers up there, and they explained to me that they'd lost 80% of their acreage available for their cattle to graze, and therefore the number of cattle they have has shrunk. And these are people who have had families up there in the cattle business for many, many generations, and they feel like David and Goliath. They feel like they're David, and they're fighting against this Goliath, which is this huge, powerful source of regulations that are from the radical progressives who care solely about the environment and not about the community. So the bottom line, New Mexico needs jobs. We want to have great opportunities for our youth, and these overregulation and these pure heavy environmental policies are devastating to our state. And another example, I mean, it's amazing. I have so many examples, and it should be very, very concerning to New Mexicans. Car dealers are in the top 10 employers in this state. Most people don't realize that, but car dealers are really a critical part of our economy. And I'm sure you all know now that there's regulations regarding the inventory that they have to have there, what types of cars those car dealers have to have. And in 2026, they'll be required to have 40% of their inventory will be electric vehicles. But only 4% of new cars in New Mexico are electric vehicles, not 40, only 4. So by forcing these car dealers to load up on electric vehicles, which will not be sold, we're basically going to force them into very, very difficult times. And again, that will create a problem for them to employ people, and jobs will be lost again. So this is a serious issue that really needs to be focused on.
Absolutely. So you've launched a New Day in New Mexico plan focused around some of these issues. And one of the things I really like about the way you present this is you ask New Mexicans to demand more on various fronts, the economy, safety, healthcare, et cetera, because one of the things that I have seen in my time watching New Mexico and the political structure here is that we just kind of accept that New Mexico should be or is 50th, and we don't do anything about it. And one of the things that can easily be done about it is changing who represents us politically. So, talk about that plan a little bit.
Yeah, so we do use that verb demand more and as opposed to deserve more because New Mexicans have to fight for change and they have to want change and they have to own that change. But I'm thrilled to be the leader for that change, and I'm thrilled to lock elbows with many, many New Mexicans to make sure that New Mexico, with all of its extraordinary benefits, right? We're an incredible state, given the labs, given our natural beauty, given the resources that are abundant in our state, and the diverse cultures that we have. We need to weave all of these strengths together and address our problems and leverage our opportunities. So, one of the first areas we'll be focused on is making sure that this economy works for New Mexicans. And I just tried to give you a bunch of examples where it's not working for New Mexicans. But, and another way the economy is failing New Mexicans is cost of living. Cost of living here is really, it's a very heavy, heavy burden for New Mexicans. Most New Mexicans don't realize that the average family income here in New Mexico is around 50,000 a year. That's close to West Virginia, and I know that's hard to hear. We don't like to think of ourselves as, in the same class as West Virginia, but we are. But nevertheless, the cost of our household items is in the top 5 in this country. So we're at the bottom in average family income, and the cost of household items are right near the top. That puts it in terrible squeeze on our average family when cost of living goes up. And so, given my experience in the capital markets, given my work and my whole life understanding finance, I understand what causes interest rates to rise. I understand the importance of planning and budgeting and cutting cost and not overspending. All of the things that the radical progressives that Biden and Martin Heinrich have done to cause our inflation and to cause the cost of living to go up. Another area that we'll really be focused on is the border. And it's so sad because the border should be a huge competitive advantage for New Mexico. And up until the last few years, we were just putting so much money in making sure that we were creating a competitive border so that we could have a strong, vibrant economy, just like Texas has along its border. But now, because of the open border, which is just letting, a huge inflows of all sorts of problems creep into our state and creep into the country, our border has become much more of a problem than a great benefit. And that needs to be completely flipped around. And it doesn't really have to be that hard. It's a matter of discipline, leadership, and clarity of thought.
Excellent. So, your campaign recently also had a launch for Women for Nella. Now, obviously, Democrats are banking on the abortion issue as being the be all end all, and certainly Kamala Harris at the very top of the ticket is focused on that. But there are other issues that affect women in our state and in our nation, and I assume that you'll be talking about some of those with this Women for Nella group.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. We just kicked off Women for Nella last week. We had a great big event at Frontier with over 100 women committing on day one. Now I think we're already close to 200 women. But you brought up the abortion issue. Let me just nail that issue so people understand my position. Because first of all, there's no one who respects women more than me, and there's no one who wants to empower women. And my policy on abortion is as follows. First of all, I will not vote for a federal ban at all on abortion. Second, I respect the Supreme Court's decision to push abortion down to the state level. And third, and it's very important, our state has already decided on its abortion policy, and I will abide by that. What I want to do is educate and empower women and shift the focus to where the focus should be. The focus should be on birth control. It should be on increasing family planning. So I'm sure you all know this, but there's 6 million pregnancies that occur every year. 3 million of those are called unintended pregnancies. 3 million unintended pregnancies. And 1 out of every 3 unintended pregnancy results in abortion. So what we need to do as a country, we need to take our resources and focus on reducing unintended pregnancies. We need to educate women on birth control policies, make sure they have access to the state-of-the-art birth control policies. We need to empower women and help them reduce the number of unintended pregnancies. So that will be my focus. And I've talked to many, many women about my approach, and it's an approach to the issue that women just instantly embrace, because it's really wrong that our country doesn't focus more on birth control, more on reducing unintended pregnancies, and less on big debates about 26 weeks, 22 weeks, 15 weeks, etc.
All right. So the economy seems to be becoming a bigger issue nationwide. Of course, stock market recently. We're recording this on Tuesday, August 6th. Yesterday, it took a very steep dive after a few days of taking a dive the previous week. It's come back a little bit, but there's a lot more concern, I think, building towards the end of the year and heading into election day, which are not that far apart from each other, that the economy is slowing down, and really we're going to possibly be in a recession. So, where do you see things going, and how do you think you would do things differently if you were in Washington, D.C.?
So first of all, just to kind of put this in context a little bit, the markets are very volatile, and often they're very volatile right before presidential elections. And this presidential election is, it in and of itself has a huge amount of variability to it, a huge amount of unpredictability to it. And as you mentioned in this call, every week there's a new dimension to this presidential race, and that's very unnerving for the markets. But it's also that one could speculate, and I'm sure there's facts to support it, that the markets prefer a Trump agenda versus a Harris agenda, because we just saw over the last 3 or 4 years what a Harris agenda will do. She's responsible. She was the co-pilot with Biden, and she's responsible for the decisions made over the last few years, which were really crippling, very, very crippling to our economy. So 4 more years of that is certainly not what the markets would want. So these geopolitical issues have to be a factor. But, there's some big underlying economic problems, like the United States deficit, the federal government spending, and the cost of interest just to cover our debt. Or there's other big problems, like we are not funding our defense capabilities well enough. Another big problem is commercial real estate. It's a huge problem sitting there ready to boil up. And then shifting back to geopolitical issues, I do blame it on the Biden-Harris administration. We have these serious, serious wars that are underway and could become huge and very, very problematic. And they're not just really limited to the Middle East. Iran and Russia and China are all uniting. So markets react to all of these underlying problems. And many, if not every single one of these underlying problems, you can attribute to the Democrat leadership, but really to the radical progressives. I want to be careful, and I want to be very thoughtful how I articulate. It's really these extreme radical progressive policies that have left America in this plight. And now you're seeing that in the market.
Yeah, it seems like the entire Democratic Party apparatus, including Martin Heinrich, are basically marching in lockstep. So there's no deviation from virtually any of them. So,
well, I do want to
yep.
point out there is some deviation in our state. There is a group of conservative Democrats who, I want to welcome to my team. Martin Heinrich literally had super PACs that are funded, where he supports within the New Mexico legislature. He supports senators and representatives who are radically progressive, and he supported them in the primary, where they were able to defeat, unfortunately, very level-headed conservative Democrats who are centrist. So there are many Democrats in this state who are not radical progressives, but they are being, attacked financially and literally by Martin Heinrich and his peers.
Got it. All right. Any last thoughts or words before we wrap things up?
No, thank you for having me. And I think the next 2 months are going to be really critical for this state. But the momentum I'm seeing, feeling, and experiencing is that people realize New Mexico is just riddled with problems, but these problems can be overcome if we have a new leader. So I'm look forward to being that new leader and helping New Mexico leverage all its strengths to be the great state it can be.
And if people want to find out more about your campaign, I know you're on X as well as the internet more broadly. Can you
Oh,
share
sure.
that
Just go to our
information?
website, Nella for Senate.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Great to be here.
Thank you very much. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.